Hello, everybody. Welcome to our mini symposium on emotion regulation. And it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Drs. Maya Tamir and Iris Mauss, who are both colleagues and dear friends. They are going to be sharing with us their research on emotion regulation, different lines of work, but that complement each other. Maya is going to be talking about motivations underlying emotion regulation, and Iris will be talking about under what conditions does emotion regulation help us versus hurt us. I think the structure is such that we'll first have Dr. Tamir talk to us about her work. We're going to have a short Q&A, a short break, and then Dr. Mauss will take over. Before I leave the stage, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Tamir's work and her background. So she got her PhD from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in 2004, did a postdoctoral training with James Gross at Stanford, started her career as an assistant professor at Boston University, but moved back home to Israel in 2010 or 2012. 2010, and that's where she has been ever since. She has had many influential lines of work. Her early work on information processing, mechanisms that underlie some of the personality traits that are kind of like, well-known, like neuroticism, positive emotions, how do positive emotions direct our cognition and attention. In more recent work, she's been focusing on emotion regulation, beliefs and goals, like whether we believe emotions are malleable, changeable, how does that impact our emotion regulation behavior. And a second line of work is on the goals that we have with respect to emotion regulation, which she's going to be talking to us about today. So without further ado, I'm leaving the stage to Maya Tamir. Her talk is titled Motivated Emotion Regulation, Navigating Our Emotions. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Thank you, Oz, for this lovely introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me here today to get to meet you and speak to you. It's a real pleasure. It's also my very first time in Istanbul, so it's very, very exciting for me. And is it working? Is it moving? Not moving, not working. Now? Oh. So Iris and I have traveled here, and traveling still feels a little bit out of the ordinary after COVID. But even before COVID, most of us spend most of our times in familiar environments, right? We live and work in the same place. We don't wonder where are we gonna go today, right? We go to the same place we typically go to. We react naturally to things, but every now and again, something changes and we need to figure out, where am I going and why am I going there? And so you can find yourself in a new city and you may wonder, what am I gonna do today? Am I gonna go to the museum? Am I gonna go to the zoo? How am I gonna get there? Am I gonna take a taxi or a bus? Will I take the red line or the blue line? And I really wanna say one main thing in this talk today. So if there's one take-home message that you take from my talk, is that we can think about emotion regulation in a very similar way to navigation in physical space. We can think about navigating in our emotional space, which really is what emotion regulation is all about. We live our lives emotionally, reacting naturally to things, But every now and again, something changes and we need to reevaluate. And then it's when we need to think, wait, where am I going to emotionally and what does that mean? So in the field of emotion regulation, when we think about navigating, the main assumption has been that when people want to move somewhere else emotionally, there's really one particular place that they want to go, and that's to feel better. And if there is one emotional destination, really what we should devote our attention to is finding efficient ways to get there. And as a field, we've done a lot. We've discovered a lot. For example, we've learned that cognitive reappraisal, which is a strategy that involves changing the way that we think about a situation so that its emotional impact changes, is a pretty effective means of transportation when it comes to emotions. But that would be similar to saying, really, the only place we want to get to is the museum, and there are no other places that we ever want to visit. And is that true for emotions as well? So what I want to do in my talk today is, first of all, suggest that it isn't true, that there are many different emotional destinations that people entertain. People differ in what they want to feel. And then I want to continue arguing that because people differ in what they want to feel, we may want to understand these emotional destinations because A, they determine the direction in which we move when it comes to emotions. And two, they may even determine how we get to the places that we get to emotionally. And then after we explore these ideas, if I have enough time, I'll talk a little bit about the potential implications of this way of thinking about emotion regulation to understanding emotion regulation and well-being. All right. So I argued before that maybe people don't always just want to feel better. Maybe there are other emotional destinations. And if there are, then we need to understand what they are. And so we'll start by convincing you that there is variation in what people want to feel. And therefore, we should proceed and understand the implications of these destinations. And there has been a lot of work by now showing that there is variation. So I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm just going to share with you very few examples. And in particular, I want to share this example from research done by Elise Calacarinos at the University of Melbourne. She ran an experience sampling study. And so she asked people 7 times a day for 14 days, the extent to which they want to feel particular emotions. The example that I want to focus on now is how happy people wanted to feel in the moment. And I'm focusing on happiness in particular because if there is an emotion that we would expect that people will desire most of the time, it's this one. So this is the one that I'm focusing on. And I'm going to show you data from one person, just one person. And what you see on the x-axis is the assessments over time. And what you see on the y-axis is the degree of happiness desired ranging from 0 to 100. And what you can see, let's see if this, oh, there it is. What you can see is that this person wanted to feel quite happy most of the time, but not all the time, right? There were times when this person didn't want to feel happy at all. Okay, so we see that there is variability over time within a person. But of course, we want to see the entire data. So let me show you the entire data. Okay, so what you see here is a beautiful kind of Jackson Pollock type of image, which is all over the place, but also delightful in many ways, because if we peek really carefully, we see this yellow line hiding here. Do you see it? So here's a person who really wanted to feel almost 100% happy all the time. But then if you look at the dark blue line right here hiding, here's a person that most of the time wanted to feel just about 50% happy. And really, I think the main thing that you see very clearly in this image is that it's all over the place, which means that people want to feel various degrees of happiness, and they vary across individuals and within individuals. But this is also a very messy, beautiful, but a very messy picture. And so we can wonder, is there a way that we can parse this mess into meaningful patterns that we can understand that can inform, things like mental health or psychological well-being? And so we can think, for example, about depression. And we can say, what do depressed people want to feel? How happy do depressed people want to feel? And does that differ from people who are healthy? And here we can say, well, one possibility is that people who are depressed really understand the deprivation, right, in happiness. And so if anything, maybe they would be somewhere in the yellow line, right, just wanting to be very happy all the time, if anything. Or we can say maybe they don't differ from people who are healthy. Or we can say, well, maybe if depressed people are people who are used not to feel happy most of the time, maybe they just want what they already have and they would want to be less happy than people who are healthy. And so if we try to examine what happy people want to feel in their daily lives over time, what we see, and again, what you see in this plot, it's a different study. It's also an experience sampling study, also measured the desired level of happiness in daily life over time. And what you see is that the blue line represents healthy people, and the red line represents depressed people. And so in their daily life, people who are depressed want to feel less happy than people who are healthy. And so what we see here is, first of all, that there is a way to find some order in the mess that I showed you before. We see here that, in fact, people do differ in what they want to feel. And we see that we can use this information to learn something important about differences between people in desired goals. Maybe if we understand this, we could also understand deficits or in emotion regulation and where and how it goes sporadically. So it's meaningful to ask what people want to feel. All right. Why should we care where people are headed emotionally? Well, let's go back to physical space and think, why should we care where people go in physical space? Because if we know where they want to get to, then we know where they're headed, right? They will go this way if they want to go to the museum, and they'll go that way if they want to get to the zoo. And so now we can ask, could we adopt the same type of thinking to understand emotion regulation? And we can ask, do goals in emotion regulation or what people want to feel, does that determine the direction in which they try to influence their emotions? And so I'm going to share throughout the talk, I'm going to share a lot of work that was done by Dr. Yael Milgram, who's a former doctoral student and now a postdoc at Harvard. And we tried to tackle pretty much the same question, just in the domain of emotion. We said, well, if people don't feel happy, they could, and they want to, if people are unhappy and they, okay, hold on. If people, moved forward rather than backwards, okay. We want to know, first of all, whether what people want to feel determines the direction in which they regulate their emotions. And I just showed you evidence suggesting that depressed people perhaps are not as motivated to feel better as people who are healthy. And now we want to know, does that in turn determine the direction in which depressed people regulate their emotion? So how do we know in which direction depressed people regulate their emotions? Well, one way that we can find out is, there we go, by giving them a really effective mode of transportation, right? And so if we give them a really effective mode of transportation, we can then set them loose in space and see where they steer the wheel and where they're headed. So that's exactly what we did in this study. We showed people pictures that were designed to make them sad. We trained them ahead of time how to use cognitive reappraisal effectively to either increase or decrease our reactions to sad images. And then instead of telling them use cognitive reappraisal to feel better, we just told them use cognitive reappraisal in response to these images, but you get to pick which way you steer the wheel, right? You get to pick whether you increase or decrease the intensity of your reactions. And then after they made their choice, they regulated according to their choice, and then they rated their feelings. Again, what we wanted to know is, now that they had a good, effective tool that could get them anywhere, where would they choose to go? And what we discovered, what you see here is sad images, right? So proportion of choosing to increase emotional intensity. And what we found is that depressed people were more likely to choose to increase their sadness rather than decrease their sadness, okay? And so what this showed us is that depressed people are less motivated to feel better, and therefore they're more likely to engage, or they're less likely to engage in emotion regulation in a way that would actually make them feel better. All right. The next question, though, is would emotion regulation also determine not just the direction, but also the means with which we try to influence our emotions? And again, I'm going back to physical space just to orient us a little bit. If you are in a new city, how would you go around? How would you move around? One thing that you can do is you can take public transportation. Come on in. Or not. It's a free country. You can take public transportation, right? You can take the blue line or you can take the red line. And if you want to get to the zoo, you're probably going to take the blue line, right? And if you want to get to the museum, you're going to take the right, obviously, right? And so now we can ask, would the same thing apply to emotion regulation? For instance, if I feel good, but I want to decrease my positive feelings, then I should be more likely to engage in a strategy that would decrease emotional intensity. On the other hand, if I want to feel more happy than I feel, I should be more likely to engage in a strategy that we know amplifies or increases emotional intensity, right? And so what I want to feel should determine, right, which strategy do I end up using? And so we tested this, and what we did in a study that we did with Galsheps, what we did in this study is we trained people, again, to use distraction and rumination. And then we told them at the beginning of the study that the goal on each trial is either to decrease or to increase emotional intensity. In other words, we pointed either at the museum or at the zoo. We told them this is where you need to go. And then we showed them a negative or a positive picture, and we told them to choose whether to use distraction or to use rumination. What we found when we did that is that in 70% of cases, when people wanted to increase emotional intensity, they used rumination. When they wanted to decrease emotional intensity, they used distraction. And that was true both when regulating responses to positive images and when regulating responses to negative images. And that was true for both depressed and undepressed people, right? They both knew that they needed to use distraction if they wanted to decrease emotional intensity. Okay. But now the question is, if people choose strategies to get to a particular goal, can we do reverse engineering and assume that people use a strategy because they have a particular goal? So the goal that you have is what determines what type of strategy you use. And so we tested this in depression. What we did in the study is show participants positive pictures. And we just asked them to choose whether they want to distract or to ruminate in response to these pictures. Now I have to pause here for a second and say that that in itself, from my perspective, is a pretty interesting novel thing to do, because when we have looked, we as a field, right, have looked at rumination and depression, we typically, what we do is we look at the frequency of engaging in this behavior. We rarely look at this active selection of rumination when there is a choice. So it's an interesting question, right? What would depressed people do when given a choice? Would they distract, right, away from positive, or would they use rumination and amplify their positive reactions? So depressed people were given an option to choose rumination or distraction. They then regulated according to their choice and rated how they felt. Okay. What we found is that depressed people were more likely to choose to distract in response to positive images, right? So they used a strategy, they chose to use a strategy, even though they had an alternative. They chose to use a strategy that would decrease the intensity of their positive feelings rather than increase the intensity of their feelings. Of course, you could still wonder, but is it because they had a goal, right? Is it because they were less motivated to feel better that they chose this goal? Or maybe it's a question of habits, right? Or maybe it's a question of, maybe it's easier for them to use distraction and that's why they did it. And so what we needed to do next is test whether goals actually influence the type of choice that depressed people do. Now, how do we test whether goals influence a choice? We manipulate them. And so we had the same participants do another block. And this time what we did is we told participants, this time, we want you to choose in a way that would make you feel better. Now, if depressed people choose to distract for reasons other than goals, then we should still see the difference between depressed and non-depressed participants. But if the reason depressed people choose to use distraction is perhaps because they're motivated, they're not as motivated to feel better, if we motivate them to feel better by telling them now choose in a way that would make you feel better, then the difference between depressed and non-depressed people should disappear. Does that make sense? Okay. And it did. So, which is what I'm showing you right here. Okay. When we told them now choose in a way that would make you feel better, there was no longer a difference between depressed and non-depressed people. What this suggests is that maybe the reason why depressed people choose to distract away from positive is because they are not as motivated to make themselves feel better as healthy people do. All right. What should we do if we want people to get to the museum? One thing we can do is we can tell them, we can buy them a ticket to the Red Line. Right? Here you go, take a ticket. The problem, of course, is that if they have a ticket and they don't know where they're going, they may stop somewhere on the way, like the supermarket, and not even get to the museum if that's not where they want to go. What we can do instead is we can say, why don't you go to the museum? There's a terrific show there. You should go see the new exhibition. And if we motivate them to go to the museum, then if they take the Red Line, they might get there faster. But they could also get there in other ways, like maybe they could walk there. Right? And what I think is that in the field of emotion regulation, we have focused a lot on strategies, and we assign many benefits to strategies where, in fact, it could be that some of the benefits that we assign to strategies may actually be attributed to the underlying motivation. Right? What is it that people use the strategies for? And I'm even going to go as far as saying that maybe this is true in the case of cognitive reappraisal. Right? We know that cognitive reappraisal is a very effective tool, and I'm not debating this. There's so much evidence from so many directions, so I'm not questioning this this idea. But what I want to gently suggest is that some of the benefits that have been attributed to cognitive reappraisal, maybe they should be attributed to motivation instead. So how did we test this idea? Well, we went back to the beginning, to the seminal paper where it all began, right? It's James Gross's paper in 1998, where he tested what are the implications or the effects of cognitive reappraisal. And yes, there have been many studies on cognitive reappraisal since that have been very sophisticated. However, at the time we wrote this paper, this was still the most widely used manipulation of cognitive reappraisal in the literature. And so here's what this strategy looks, what this manipulation looks like. Participants in the cognitive reappraisal condition are told, please try to adopt a detached and unemotional attitude as you watch the film, negative film. Try to think about what you're seeing in such a way that you don't feel anything at all. And this is a fantastic way to manipulate cognitive reappraisal because it asks participants to change how they think about the event. The thing is that participants are also asked to be unemotional and feel nothing at all, which has nothing to do with a strategy, it's a goal. And so what we have is we have a manipulation that simultaneously involves both manipulating a goal and manipulating a strategy, and then we're comparing it to an empty control condition. So we don't really know whether the effects are due to the goal that we manipulated or the strategy that we manipulated. And so what we did is we teased these apart. We replicated the study, but we added a third condition. And in the third condition, we just manipulated the goal, right? We basically said, hey, go to the museum, okay? Try to decrease your emotional reactions as much as possible. And we wanted to see how these three conditions would differ. So what you see here on the x-axis are the three conditions. What you see on the y-axis is self-reported anger because it was an anger-inducing film. And all I'm showing you here is just a replication of the classic effect, right? So people who received the classic reappraisal manipulation did in fact experience less anger compared to people in the control condition. The interesting question is what's going to happen for people who were just told to go to the museum, right? Just decrease your emotions. Would they, I mean, what could happen is that if people are generally motivated to feel better, then telling them feel better shouldn't do anything, right? But if people are not always motivated to feel better and it does do something, then maybe we'll find an interesting pattern here. And what we found in this condition is that it did not differ at all from the classic reappraisal condition. So people who were just told decrease your emotions were as effective as participants who were told decrease your emotions and use cognitive reappraisal to do it. Now, you may wonder, maybe they all used reappraisal spontaneously. And some of them did use reappraisal spontaneously, but that did not account for our effects because people used significantly less reappraisal in this condition compared to the condition where they were explicitly told to use a reappraisal. You may also wonder, maybe it's social demand. We told people make yourself feel better, and now they're telling us, no, sure, I feel better. So, we replicated it with corrugator activation, right? So this is the muscle that's responsible for frowning and is consistently associated with negative affect. And you see exactly the same pattern. When we tell people just try to decrease your emotions, they do it as effectively as people who are told to reappraise. We then ran another study where we repeated this design with a fourth condition, where we just manipulated the strategy without the goal, right? So we told people now, try to change the meaning that you give to the situation so it changes your emotional reactions to the film, but we didn't tell them in which direction they need to change their emotions to the film. We showed them a film that was negative. It was a complex film, kind of similar to things that happen in daily life where, it could be somewhat good. It could be, maybe you need to be angry. Maybe you don't need to be angry. But we wanted to see what people do spontaneously. And so, again, I'm showing you the same kind of pattern. I'm first showing you that, yes, we replicated the classic effects of people who were given the original reappraisal instructions did feel less sad in this context. And now I'm showing you a lovely replication of the previous study where people who just were told to decrease were as effective as people who were told to decrease while using reappraisal. And now the question is, what's going to happen when we tell people here is a ticket to the red line, right? Where would they end up? And what we discovered is that telling people to reappraise without telling them where to go didn't lead them to decrease their emotions. They did not differ from people in the watch condition. When we probed a little bit further, we discovered that some people increased the intensity of their sadness and some people decreased the intensity of their sadness, but overall, there was no difference. So what this suggests is that what we want to feel, right, these emotional destinations that we have are really important to understand emotion regulation. They can set us on our way, and they may ultimately get us where we want to get to, regardless, sometimes, of the means to get there. Okay. What are the implications of thinking about emotion regulation as a form of navigation? What does that mean for well-being? I have no sense what time is it. How much time do I have? 40?
Yeah, you still have plenty of time.
Oh, wow. Okay, I was running really fast. Okay. 4 or 40? That isn't it like, isn't the whole talk 40 minutes? Yeah.
How much time?
How much time? I'm going to keep going until somebody stops me. How about that? Okay, so what are the implications of this for well-being? And this is a really broad question. If I have more time, I can talk without slides because I have lots of things to say. One possibility is that there are no implications for emotional destinations, that really what matters is how people actually feel. I don't have a slide for that because I think that's ridiculous, but it is an option and it's not a ridiculous option. Another option is that what people want to feel, where they want to get to emotionally, could have implications for well-being, and we need to understand what they are. And one could argue that maybe there are good destinations and bad destinations, right? And we need to figure out what the good destinations are and send people that way. For example, maybe it's good to try to feel better or happier or less sad. And there is some data that's consistent with this idea. And I'm going to share with you data that Yael collected. It's a longitudinal study where we measured what depressed and non-depressed people wanted to feel, and particularly how happy they wanted to feel. We measured that at the beginning of the semester, and then we returned to these participants at the end of the semester during exam periods. You guys have exam periods, so you know what I'm talking about. It's a very stressful time. And what we wanted to know is whether the degree of happiness that people were striving for at the beginning of the semester, does that then predict the degree of the level of their clinical symptoms during the stressful period at the end of the semester? And what we found when we did this is that it does in a meaningful way, right? So depressed people who were more motivated to feel happy, subsequently during stress experienced less depressive symptoms, less clinical symptoms. And this was true in a cross-lag design. So even when we controlled for clinical symptoms at the beginning of the semester or motivation for happiness at the end of the semester, wanting to feel more happy predicted better outcomes at the end of the semester. So this suggests, right, that maybe wanting to be happy is a great thing and we should push people toward that. That's not what I think, actually. And it's not what I think because what makes destinations good or bad are a variety of factors, right? There is no one, I mean, museums are great, but who are we to say that museums are better than zoos? And maybe it's different in the case of emotions. I'm not saying that it isn't, but I want to introduce the possibility that there is more than one possible desirable destination in emotions. In fact, what makes emotional destinations desirable could have to do with values and beliefs and our social environment and many, many things, right, that make museums more or less attractive to people. For instance, one of the things that might matter quite a bit is where is that museum compared to where you're currently at? So let me give you an example in the world of, in the emotion domain. So here we have two nice people. They kind of look similar, right? So two nice people, person A and person B. And you can see here, person A is less happy objectively compared to person B. And so it could be that person B is more satisfied with their life than person A just because he's objectively happier. However, what we also know about person A is that he wants to be just a little happier than he actually is. Okay? Whereas person B, who is objectively happier, wants to be a whole lot happier than he actually is. And now riddle me this, right? Who among these two is more satisfied with their lives? We tested this. Well, we didn't really test it, but we began to tickle this question ever so slightly in a project that we did several years ago. What we did in this study, we did it with Shalom Schwartz, and we asked participants in 8 different countries around the world to rate their typical emotional experiences. So how do they typically feel? We also asked them how do they want to feel in general. And then we took indices of psychological health like satisfaction with life and depressive symptoms. And what we wanted to know is the difference, right? The discrepancy between where you are at emotionally and where you want to be emotionally, does that matter for well-being? What we expected is that people would be better off if the discrepancy is closer, right? If they feel what they want to feel. And so we took the difference between desired emotions and current emotions, first and foremost. And before we moved any further, we wanted to know, what does this difference look like? I mean, is there variability in this thing? And what we found is that not only is there variability, but it actually goes both ways. So if we look, for example, at love and empathy, you can see that most people want to feel more love and empathy than they do. There are some people who also want to feel less love and empathy than they do. And if we look at another example, hatred and anger and contempt, thank God that most people want to feel less than they do, but there is also an amount of people who want to feel more. And so looking at the discrepancy would tell us something meaningful beyond just absolute levels of experiencing or desiring these emotions. And what we wanted to know is, how are these discrepancies related to well-being? And what we found is that the larger the discrepancies, we're going back or forth, the larger the discrepancies, the worse people were in terms of their well-being. The more depressed they were and the less satisfied with their lives. Okay? And that was true for people who wanted to feel more love than they do. The more love they want compared to what they feel, the worse off they are. But it's also true for people who wanted to feel less love than they do. So they feel quite a bit of love. They want to feel less, and they're still less satisfied with their lives. And it's also true for people who want to feel less hatred and contempt than they do, and for people who want to feel more anger than they do. And that is true even when we control for desired emotions and experienced emotions. So it's not just that people who want to feel less love feel so much love that they're happy. No, because we controlled for how much love they were feeling and for how much love they desired. And we still found that the greater discrepancies, the worse off people were. And it wasn't moderated by culture. So it was the same pattern across. And of course, this is we're just really tickling the beginning of exploring what these discrepancies mean in emotion regulation. But I think what this might be telling us is that maybe people are better off if they reach their desired destinations, if they feel what they want to feel. Or maybe people are better off if they're at home, right? If they want to feel what they already feel. Okay, so what I tried to do today, and again, I don't know how much time I have. So okay. No, that's fine. What I tried to do today is convince you that maybe we can think about emotion regulation as a form of navigation, right? In a space that's emotional rather than physical, and that doing so could introduce interesting novel questions in the field. And so I showed you that people have multiple emotional destinations, not just one, that this destination could determine where people the direction in which people regulate their emotion, and maybe even it determines the means with which people regulate their emotions. And I very gently tried to begin to explore interesting various implications for well-being. I think that once we think about emotion regulation from this perspective, many new questions arise. For instance, where do emotional destinations come from, right? Why do I want to go to the museum instead of the zoo when it comes to emotions? How does my culture or my social environment influence and shape emotional destinations and my way to get there? How do my destinations, where's Ovgun sitting? How do my destinations influence the way that I regulate the emotions of others? And how does a close other's emotional destination influence the way that they behave to me? So all these questions all of a sudden kind of become apparent when we use this metaphor to understand emotion regulation. All right. So I want to thank you. I want to thank the funders, and I want to thank the amazing team of students and the amazing collaborators, including Iris, who are involved in this research, and you for listening to me patiently. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. I'm also translating the questions from the chat to in-person context. Are there any questions from the audience?
I would like to ask you a question about the, as you say, that in the depressive patients, they are less motivated to feel more positive emotions like the happiness. What about the bipolar patients? Because they have major episodes and also manic episodes. So in the manic episode, maybe their motivation also change. And what is the underlying mechanism in it? Do you have any think about it?
Yes, so these were two questions. I'm going to repeat them for people who may not have heard. First, what about bipolar patients, right? People who suffer from bipolar disorder, what would they do? We know what they want to feel. That was question number one. And question number two is what underlies these emotional destinations? And so regarding bipolar disorder, I do have an answer, which is, so this is the project that we did with June Gruber. And we, hold on, let me flip the order in which I'm going to answer this, because then it would be easier to explain the first answer. What is the mechanism? We don't know what the mechanism is. What we're thinking might be the mechanism is potentially familiarity, right? We know that people tend to prefer emotions that are more familiar to them, right? Home, sweet home. And so when we experience something and we become familiar with it, we tend to value it a little bit more positively. And so we think that maybe in the case of depression, it's familiarity that's driving the effect, and then kind of self-verification of sorts. If that is true, going back to bipolar, then we can think, okay, well, what are the things emotionally that are characteristic of people who suffer from bipolar disorder? First of all, they experience a lot of depression. Every now and then they experience manic disorder, so it's high positive arousal. Maybe they would show preferences for both of these things. If we compare them to healthy individuals or depressed individuals, what we might see is that people with bipolar differ in the desirability of negative affect in a way that's similar to depression, but they will not differ in the desirability of positive affect compared to healthy people, maybe compared to depression, but not compared to healthy people, because healthy people also want to feel a lot of positive affect most of the time. The other, which is what we found. The other thing that we suspected is that what characterizes bipolar disorder is not just these extreme states, but its variability, right? So it's shifting from one emotion to another. And so we tested this in a variety of ways, including, for example, to show people emotional stimuli and then ask them to choose when they want to move to a different stimuli and which stimuli they want to move to. So if I show you a positive picture, would you then choose to look at another positive picture, or would you choose to look at negative picture? And if I ask you, how frequently do you want your mood to change? Right? I can look at minutes or seconds or hours. And what we find is that people who suffer from bipolar disorder want to change their mood more frequently, right? And it's this difference in the rate of change in emotion that best characterizes them across studies. Yes.
Thank you very much for the great talk. So since the beginning, I've been asking, like, there's this discrepancy that you observe, and that make me think, like, how much self-awareness people have from the healthy and control group, because maybe the depressed person, and in your analogy, knows, like, I have boots or high heels, so I cannot really walk to the museum. Maybe zoo is a more manageable target, and the other people just wear their sneakers and run to the museum, maybe stop in the zoo. So I think the way we can quantify self-awareness may influence those effects as well, right? Is there a way to measure that?
Well, I got really excited when I heard your question because I have new data. But then I realized it's not exactly answering your, I'm going to share it anyway because it's exciting, but actually it's not exactly what you're asking. You're asking about how aware people are of the discrepancy, right, between what they want to feel and what they actually feel. What we did in a recent study, and this is, we haven't submitted the paper yet, so it's fresh off the press. It was an experience sampling study where we wanted to tap exactly this question, right? So what is well, not exactly, close. We wanted to see what are the discrepancies between desired and experienced emotions, and to what extent does larger discrepancies shift people into action, right? Make them initiate emotion regulation, because this is what we predict, right? So the larger the discrepancy, theoretically, people should be more motivated to regulate their emotions if they're aware of it, right? And so is this the same for depressed and non-depressed individuals? And the answer is, first of all, yes, larger discrepancies do predict attempts at emotion regulation. Whew. Okay, that makes sense. And yes, they're not the same for depressed and non-depressed individuals. exactly in the way that I think you would predict. So that people who are healthy are very attuned to the size of the discrepancy between desired and experienced emotions. Depressed people are less attuned to them. What happens in depression is you're kind of in hyper mode all the time. And so you're less sensitive to whether you actually need to regulate your emotions or not, which is very, very much consistent with what you said. The only reason why I said it's not exactly the same is because we don't know actually whether people are aware of it or not. They rate how they feel. They rate how they want to feel, but we didn't ask them, how different do you think? Like, what is your perception of this discrepancy? So that we don't know yet.
What would be your prediction? It's just a short follow-up. So what would be your prediction when you show the time series of like where people want to be in terms of happiness for those groups? So there's some difference in terms of like the mean happiness for control and treatment. But what would happen if you draw the same data in two dimensions? One dimension is the mean for each individual, and the second dimension is standard deviation of their time series, the ones that kind of like juggles ups and downs.
I mean, in terms of standard deviation of desired emotions, you saw it in the figure, right? You can see the standard deviation, it's not that much different.
They might cluster into
Well, that's not true. So there is a difference in the variability of emotion goals between depressed and non-depressed participants, especially when it comes to happiness. And I think I may be misremembering because this is really like, I just saw this data not too long ago. But I think what we found is that depressed people have larger variability in preferences for happiness. Yeah. Good intuition.
I'm going to take some space to voice one of the questions from the remote.
And I'll also be around later. So if anybody has questions, I'd be more than happy to address anything.
So this question is with respect to the last study you presented within your presentation. Robert Wood says, surely it's just as likely that less happy people also tend to be less satisfied people, less satisfied with their feelings and also their finances, love lives, etc. question mark. So I think.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, people who are less happy objectively are less satisfied with their lives, for sure.
I think the question is
but yes, I get that. But what we did in that study is control for actual emotions, right? So when we ask about desirability of something, we also control for actual experienced affect as a predictor. It's true that there was a main effect for experienced affect, so that people who felt, for example, and I just showed you here two examples, there were other emotions that were tested, but people who feel more love and people who feel less anger are more satisfied with their lives. But even when we control for that, we find that there is variance to be explained by the discrepancy. Yeah. We have time for more? One more question.
Correct way to tell people to how to navigate their emotions, how to direct your emotions.
It's a beautiful question. It's my question too. I don't know the answer. And I think we need to be really, really careful. We want simple answers. We want simple answers in our lives. We want simple answers in our research. It would have been great if there was one destination. Mm-hmm. And we can say, look, everybody needs to be happy and then all our problems would be solved. We know that that's not true. There are multiple emotion goals and there may be different emotional destinations for different people. There may be different emotional destinations for different people in different contexts. So I would be very hesitant to give advice until I have a good answer to that. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, I was joking with Iris, asking her if she's going to come back and defend to us reappraisal, but she said no. On the contrary, we're going to make the story even more complicated and complex, just like real life. So my dear colleague and friend, Iris Mauss, got her PhD in 2005 from Stanford. So you were a postdoc while she was a graduate student. So that's the connection where the collaboration started from. And Iris is one of those rare people who went to have an assistant professor position without a postdoc. Nowadays, it's like unheard of. Got tenure at Denver, gave up tenure at Denver to come to Berkeley, went through tenure again at Berkeley. And she's been with us ever since. Very prolific, wonderful researcher, teacher, mentor. She's amassed a long list of awards that I will not get into the details of, but I should mention two of her areas of research that have been very influential. One is, of course, on emotion coherence among different systems that underlie our emotions, physiological, subjective, and expressive expression of our emotions, and whether coherence among those systems have implications for relationships, well-being, etc. And the second line of work is on cognitive reappraisal, emotion regulation, individual differences in the use of different strategies, and under what conditions are they helpful versus hurtful, which is what she's going to be talking to us today. Again, without further ado, here is Iris Mauss. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think I got it. Sorry, I'm gonna track time a little bit. All right. Hi, everybody. I think everybody can hear me okay? Yes. Okay. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me and organizing this, to Emre and Gu and Ozlem and Ovgun, who's been organizing all of this. So lovely to be here with you, talk to you in this beautiful, very special city. I want to talk about emotion regulation, continuing the theme of Maya's research. And I'm going to look at emotion regulation specifically in the context of adversity and stress. And as Lem already alluded to, I will look at where it might help and where it might hinder potentially. So in the context of stress, I would argue emotion regulation might be particularly impactful and important. Stress, we all are familiar with. Unfortunately, it comes in many different shapes and forms. Loss, relationship conflicts, poverty, financial distress, pandemic, catastrophes. Those varied experiences all share one thing in common, which is that when they are extreme and or chronic, they can have devastating effects on our health and functioning. And these are just a few of the effects that stress can have: depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, impaired performance, cardiovascular illness, impaired immunity, dementia risk, and untimely death. What we all know what stress feels like, and we all probably have observed in ourselves and in others these negative effects of stress. And this graph here shows sort of the average human response to stress, the harmful long-term effects that stress can have. But we probably also have ourselves or in others observed that stress doesn't necessarily and always have those average negative effects. We might know people who have experienced adversity, sometimes even extreme adversity, but who show something more like what this green line shows, sort of a recovery of health and well-being. And we refer to that often as resilience. So the question then arises, what helps people land on this green line versus the red line? If we can understand the factors that lead to this resilience, we might learn something really intriguing about resilience, about human response to stress, and also something really practical in that we might all then adopt those factors that lead to resilience. So stress is unavoidable, but there's vast variation in how people respond to stress. And the question is, what explains that variation? One potential answer to that question is suggested when we look at what makes stress toxic, or what's at the core of what makes stress harmful. And many people have argued that that is emotions. At the core of what makes stress be stress and stressful is an abundance of negative emotions, like anger, sadness, hopelessness, anxiety, and so forth. But what Maya already alluded to in her talk, there's sort of a second aspect to the emotional responses to stress that's not redundant with the overabundance of negative emotions. And that's an underabundance or too little of positive emotions. So not enough joy, not enough happiness, not enough feelings of strength, and so forth. And this distinction is going to become important later on again, that sort of the too much negative is not the same, it's not redundant with the too little positive. So then, if this emotional pattern is what makes stress toxic, if we can find a way to neutralize that emotional pattern, to decrease the negative, increase the positive via emotional regulation, maybe then that is a key to resilience. Now, this is easier said than done. And so the next question we might have is, well, we're talking about sort of intense stressors, adversity. Those experiences can feel overpowering. How would humans do this? Decrease negative, increase positive in the face of stress. Now, Maya's research set us up beautifully for one potential answer to that question. And it comes from a model of emotion that basically says that people's emotional responses are not a direct reaction to the stressors they encounter, but rather they're filtered through people's appraisals, how they think about stressful events. So we could take advantage then of the human agentic ability to potentially change their own appraisals, reach in and alter how they see stressful situations to potentially alter emotional responses in a pretty powerful way. So just to go back to an example, say you undergo a divorce. One way to think about that is that this is a terrible event that will destroy your family and will mark you for life, something that you will never overcome, right? That's a really natural way of thinking about a stressful event. But we could sort of take a minute and sort of rethink our perspective, change the narrative maybe a little bit, and think, well, this is painful, but maybe it's for the better. Maybe the relationship of our family will change for the better. This is something that connects me to other people in a meaningful way. For sure, a painful experience, but it makes me part of what's human. It's part of humanity. And so we could think that then this sort of changing appraisal or reappraisal could alter the emotional responses. It could lead to less negative, more positive emotion. I think you can imagine that for other negative events as well. And I just want to emphasize that I'm not saying, oh, we're denying here that this is a painful thing. This is not denial. It's changing the narrative in sometimes subtle ways. So together then, these considerations lead us to a pretty simple model whereby perhaps reappraisal is a human capacity that will disconnect stressors from their long-term negative effects. And reappraisal might do so by changing the emotions that we experience. And I want to show you a few lines of research that speak to this model, examine it from various directions. And I want to start by first showing sort of a proof of concept that basically answers the question whether reappraisal might support resilience. And then next, I want to examine how reappraisal might do so, the emotional mechanisms. I want to then examine a little bit what might help people use reappraisal, and then end by making things more complicated and ask about boundary conditions. So does reappraisal support resilience? And in this study that we did actually about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, Alison Troy, former student of mine, basically wanted to examine this question in people who had experienced real-life stressors from the community. So recruited women who had experienced stressors recently, wide range of those stressors, some more mild, like women who had to move, some kind of moderate, like having a divorce, all the way to more severe stressors, like losing a friend. We then wanted to measure reappraisal ability. And we wanted to do so not by asking people, how good are you at using reappraisal, but sort of thinking that it might be a little bit like intelligence, like where you can't sort of necessarily ask people, how smart are you, and expect people to have an accurate answer. We wanted to create a task that basically put people's ability to use reappraisal to the test. We brought them into the lab and showed them 3 sad film clips. Those are 2-minute film clips. I want to just note that when you bring people alone into the lab and you show these sort of pretty emotional film clips, it evokes real emotion. Like we have participants cry. It's a real emotion. That's important to note. We then in the first film clip, just have them watch the film clip to establish a sort of sadness baseline. And either the second or the third film clip, we asked participants to use reappraisal. And these are the instructions that we used while they were watching the film clip. We told them, try to think about the situation you see in a more positive light. For example, try to imagine advice that you could give to the characters in the film clip to make them feel better. Even though a situation may be painful in the moment, in the long run, it could have unexpected good outcomes. So we give a couple of examples of what a reappraisal might look like. The way this works, basically participants watch a film clip. In this case, it shows the son who has cancer going into surgery. And while they watch this intense negative film clip, they have to come up with a way to see it in a more positive light and to change their emotions. So you can imagine this is actually a pretty difficult thing, I would say, to do. After each film clip, we ask them to report how much sadness they experience. And we then basically take a different score to see how much they were able to reduce their sadness when they were instructed to do this. So that's our reappraisal ability score. And this graph here is actually from a later, larger study to show the distribution. And what you see is basically, it's sort of a normal distribution. And some people are really good at using reappraisal. So those would be the people here in the high end. And then some people are actually really bad at using reappraisal. They experience more sadness when you ask them to use reappraisal than when you don't. And then most people are somewhere in the middle on the distribution. So then this is the laboratory paradigm to measure individual differences in reappraisal ability. And the question now is whether this would alter the link between stressor, severity of stress that participants experience and depression symptoms. So this graph here will show low stress on the left, high life stress on the right. And then two sets of bars, one for people who are really good at using reappraisal in the laboratory paradigm, and then one for people who are really bad at using reappraisal in the laboratory paradigm. And these bars here show that sort of the canonical link. More life stress translates into more depressive symptoms for people who are bad at using reappraisal in the lab. Now here are the participants who were in this laboratory challenge good at using reappraisal. And what you see is that essentially what it looks like, the reappraisal ability essentially neutralize the effects of stress, in that high and low stress participants are indistinguishable from one another in terms of their depressive symptoms. And we replicated this pattern in a couple of different samples, including with daily diary samples, where we sort of tracked daily levels of reappraisal ability, and again found that it's disconnected stress from depressive symptoms that were experienced. So what this suggests then is that reappraisal might be one of the resilience factors that helps people to exhibit resilience after experiencing stressful life events. Now, the next question that we had was whether emotions really play a mechanistic role in this link. So is it the case that reappraisal helps people be resilient because it alters sort of their emotional diet, if you will? So that's the question that we addressed in this next study. The study was led by Phoebe Lamb and Brett Ford, and in collaboration with Oliver John, and my colleague at Berkeley. So in this study, we again recruited participants who had experienced recent life stress. Again, wide range of stressors. These are community samples, including unemployment, divorce, loss, and so forth. One sample consisted of about half women. The other sample consisted of all women, and they ranged from about 20 years of age to 80. We started the study by having participants fill out reappraisal surveys. And then a week later, they started filling out 2 weeks of daily diaries. Every day they were asked about the most stressful event of the past 24 hours that they experienced. And you can imagine those events range really widely again. So it's a really complex, rich data set. They will be things like, my neighbor said hello in a crabby way, sort of funny things that upset humans, right? But they also like include very stressful events, like my husband was arrested and put into jail today. So it's a really wide range of stressors that our participants talk about. And then every day we ask about the negative as well as the positive emotions that they experience 1 hour after the day's most stressful event. 6 months later, we had them not come back, but fill out surveys online that assessed their well-being, and that's our outcome that we want to predict. So I first want to briefly just show you the emotions that participants experienced an hour after their daily most stressful event. These are negative emotions. And again, we're looking across a wide range of experiences, like the stress, sad, worried, frustrated. We're going to average across all of them. They all behaved similarly in showing elevated negative emotions. The next one maybe is more interesting, and that's the positive emotions. When we first started this, we were like, it's almost a little bit perverse to ask people about their positive emotions during the day's most stressful events. And so to us, it was interesting to sort of observe what positive emotions, or would people even talk about having experienced positive emotions? And yes, again, the various positive emotions, happy, content, proud, excited, for example, all behaved similarly, and we saw elevated positive emotions an hour after the day's most stressful event. And actually comparing the emotions, you see even more positive emotions descriptively than negative emotions. So it's not, what I want to say is that it's not absurd to be talking about positive emotions in the context of stressful events. And that, once again, is going to become important in 2 slides. So we next wanted to see whether those emotions, individual variation in those emotions, would be predicted by reappraisal. And second, whether it would play a mediating role in the link between reappraisal and well-being outcomes 6 months later. So here we're seeing sort of the standard link: reappraisal, predictive well-being. Reappraisal is good, yay. But this one was really surprising to us. Reappraisal actually did not predict negative emotions in response to the day's most stressful event. And I think this links up beautifully with what Maya was talking about. The speculation is that maybe people are smart about the emotional goals that they try to achieve. And maybe they know something that Maya's research, about what Maya's research shows. Maybe it's not so smart to do away with your negative emotions. And we'll come back to that idea later on. But what we do find is that reappraisal in both samples predicted how much positive emotions people felt after the day's most stressful event. And this was true across all the positive emotions we assessed. And in turn, those positive emotions predicted well-being,
and there were reliable indirect effects in both cases. So this suggests then that emotions seem to play a role in helping reappraisal lead to predict resilience, and it might be something specific about positive emotions that's important here. Okay, having established sort of the usefulness of reappraisal, we then went on a little tangent, becoming interested in what might help people use reappraisal. What might give rise to being a good reappraiser, what might give rise to using reappraisal wisely. And this research was led by Brett Ford. We were once again inspired by research that Maya Tamir had conducted on the beliefs that people have about emotions. And what we reasoned was that fundamental beliefs that people have, the values, and how they think about the world should play a role in what emotion regulation strategies they engage in. And one particular belief that Maya's research had pointed us to is the belief that emotions are controllable, malleable versus not. Sometimes also referred to as entity or growth beliefs about emotions. And one example item that exemplifies an entity belief about emotions is people have very little control over their feelings. An item that exemplifies a growth belief about emotions is people can change their feelings if they want to. And Maya's research has shown that people differ with respect to how much they believe emotions can be changed versus emotions are unchangeable. And what Brett hypothesized was that this should play a really important and deep role in how much reappraisal people engage in. If you don't believe that you can change your emotions, you're not even going to try to use any kind of emotion regulation. So in the study, we tested this in youth, children and adolescents from 8 to 16 years of age. And we were really interested in that age group in particular because this is the age when emotion beliefs first sort of crystallized form, and also unfortunately an age where emotion regulation becomes especially important when many youths develop depression. So it might be a particularly interesting and important age to look at beliefs about emotions and their sequelae. So in a first wave of data collection, we asked the participants about their beliefs about emotion. And we also asked them and their parents to tell us about their depressive symptoms. And then a year and a half later, we again asked about, we asked them about their use of reappraisal and their depressive symptoms again. And so what we want to know about is whether beliefs about emotions predict reappraisal, which then in turn might predict depressive symptoms. And indeed, we found that growth beliefs predicted greater use of reappraisal in the youth participants, as well as depressive symptoms, including when we adjust for initial symptoms, and there was an indirect effect via reappraisal in this. So this suggests that the larger set of beliefs that people hold about emotions plays a role in predicting reappraisal. And specifically, the more growth beliefs people hold about their emotions, the more reappraisal they would use. This then sort of set the stage for us to go further downstream or upstream, if you will. And this is a study with Felicia Zerbas and Serena Chen, both at UC Berkeley. And here we were interested in looking at sort of the greater social context and how that might shape the beliefs that people hold about emotions. Their standing in their social relationships, in their social hierarchies that they're embedded in. And specifically, we argued or thought that people's sense of power, which is assessed with items like, I think I have a great deal of power, might be linked to how they think about their own emotions. Greater sense of power, which is shaped by our social standing and our social context, might kind of generalize to our emotions, such that the more sense of power we generally have, the more control we also might feel we have over our emotions. And we tested this in a couple of different studies, both sort of with surveys and with daily diaries. In both cases, we found that the more people generally felt powerful in their social relationships, the more they also felt that they had control over their own emotions. And the same was true in the daily diaries. And in turn, these beliefs again predicted reappraisal as well. And this sort of suggests that the greater social ecology, if you will, that people find themselves in shapes their beliefs about emotions and in turn their emotion regulation. So I ended with the idea that reappraisal is really useful. It helps people be more resilient. And in general, it's connected to a sense of power in general and with regard to our emotions. But of course, we're psychologists, we can't leave things just be simple and straightforward. But rather we were skeptical. Is reappraisal always beneficial? Most things in life, maybe no things in life, are always one thing or the other. And we thought the same might be true in the context for reappraisal. And we're not just sort of empty-handedly skeptical, but we had specific ideas about when and why that might be the case. And I want to go back to the stressors that people experience. One of the stressors that I mentioned was a loss. And that's a particular kind of stress, right? And we might say that it's one of the most salient aspects of it is that it's uncontrollable. Somebody dies, there's nothing we can do about it, right? So in this particular type of stressful experience, all we can do is regulate the self, right? Because there's nothing we can do to exert control over this stressful context. And here, reappraisal being a type of self-regulation, reappraisal might be beneficial, right? That makes sense. But not all stressful events are uncontrollable. Let's say you have a fight with a dear friend. That's also really stressful, but it's not as uncontrollable, right? Because you can call up your friend, you can buy them flowers, you can sort of reconcile, you can do something about the stressful event to change it. And maybe you should do something about the stressful event to change the root cause of it. So here you can, and maybe you should regulate the situation. Now, if you use reappraisal in this context, that might not be the smartest thing to do because it diverts motivation maybe away from what you really ought to do, which is changing the bad situation. So maybe reappraisal here might be useless or even harmful. And in this next study, which was led by Alison Troy, we wanted to test that idea. And we once again recruited community participants and had them complete that same laboratory measure of reappraisal ability that I talked about earlier. We then measured severity of recent life stressors across the past 18 months. And then we had secondary participants, or we'll call them raters, rate how controllable all the stressors were that our primary participants had experienced. And those coders were matched on the primary participants with respect to socioeconomic status and so forth, because you can see how those socio-demographic variables would impact how controllable a stressor appears, right? If you had, say, a lot of money, lots of stressors are more controllable compared to if you don't have a lot of money. So they rated how controllable the life stressors had been. So, and we're going to look at depressive symptoms. And in this first graph, I'm showing you relatively uncontrollable stress participants. And so what you see here is basically the same pattern that I showed you earlier, but it's a little bit weaker. So participants with high reappraisal ability were more inured to the effects of stress than those low in reappraisal ability. And then here on the right-hand side is the participants who had experienced more controllable stress. And here you see that we actually see the opposite pattern. So if anything, high reappraisal ability is bad for, is bad for participants. They actually showed more depressive symptoms compared to participants with low reappraisal ability. So this suggests that reappraisal is useless, maybe even harmful, when one can, maybe should control one's situation rather than one's emotions. And I want to just briefly show a second way of looking at what we think might be the same phenomenon in sort of a larger ecology context. And that's looking at socioeconomic status as a proxy for controllability of stressful events. Thinking that higher socioeconomic status in general is linked to having greater control over one's environment. You have more resources to deal with things. What that means is that in higher socioeconomic status, people, reappraisal should be less reliably linked with outcomes, because here you can and therefore maybe should do something about the stressors you experience. We operationalized SES with income. So thinking that lower income is a proxy for less controllability, we should see greater effects of reappraisal in lower compared to higher income participants. And we showed that across a couple of different ways of indexing reappraisal and reappraisal ability, that was the case. Greater effects for lower income participants compared to higher income participants. Okay, so this then indicates that reappraisal might be useless, maybe even harmful in more controllable adversity. I wanna, in this very last study, I show you examine a little bit more. Oh, good. Okay. Sort of this mechanism that I have speculated about, and that's the idea that why is reappraisal useless or harmful? That it's because it takes away motivation from doing something about the bad context that we find ourselves in. And so it makes us feel better and therefore more complacent is the idea. And we examined this idea, Brett Ford, Phoebe Lamb, Matt Feinberg, and Oliver John, in the context of the 2016 Trump, I call him the Trump presidential election, you know what I mean, where Trump was elected president. That was a very stressful event for many Americans. And we would argue, at least in part, it's a controllable stressor because you can't do anything about the elections themselves, but you can do something about the bad situation that ensued. You can protest, you can take action to change things. You can at least try to. So what we did is we looked at this in Hillary Clinton voters because those are the people where we knew that's a stressor for them. And we started on the day after the election, and we are going to examine reappraisal. And I just want to give a couple of examples. This person here said, this participant said, this will go down in history as one of the most disgraceful presidencies in the history of the United States. So this is someone who is not reappraising. This person here said, I don't believe in most of Trump's policies, but on the other hand, I don't believe or agree with the old way. So this is a person who illustrates reappraisal. And so what we're going to be interested in is whether reappraisal in this context predicts negative emotions, sadness, disgust, worry, anger. And we looked at this both by just assessing reappraisal, but also by manipulating it in an experimental way. And then we're going to be interested in political actions, posting on social media, donating, conversations with other people, contacting representatives, protesting, and so forth. And so a whole range of political actions that people might or might not take. And across 6 different studies, both manipulating reappraisal and just measuring it, we found that greater reappraisal was indeed linked with less negative emotions across all the emotions, including anger. And in turn, those negative emotions predicted less political action, both political action that people said they intended in engaging in and political action that they said they actually did engage in. So what the study then lends some support for is the idea that reappraisal might be useless or harmful because it makes people feel, exactly because it makes people feel better and therefore more complacent. And this goes directly back to one of Maya's points too, that negative emotions might not always be, reducing negative emotions might not always be the best goal to have. Okay, so I want to just very briefly sum up what we learned from this research that I showed. People have the potential to be resilient is one of the most basic insights. The key to resilience is reappraisal, the ability to change how we think about the world, including how we think about adversity. Reappraisal shapes resilience by transforming emotional responses to stress, both positive and negative emotion. What people believe about emotions matters, And then lastly, reappraisal can be useless or harmful. Sometimes it's better to feel negative emotions and to change one's situation. With that, I want to thank you so much. My lab, here's a pandemic lab meeting picture, and funding agencies. Thank you so much.
Perfect timing. We have 10 minutes, 11 minutes for questions. And again, I will translate the questions from the chat.
Okay.
As they come in.
But
Audience first.
Good. Yeah.
I have a question about the last study you mentioned about the elections and the controversity. I wonder if you check the participants' perception of the controversity of the situation, whether they perceive that they can change something in it, or if they also perceive it as controllable or not, and if this perception of controllability interact with any of them.
Yeah. I love that question. And it's one that we talk about a lot in my lab. And with the collaborators. So the question is, what about perception of controllability? Specifically, you asked about the last study, but I think it's a great question always, right? In all of in this whole line of research. And so we did not ask participants in this particular study about their perception of controllability. And in general, I think the broader idea that I have is that it's not about participants' perception of controllability, but how controllable the situation really is. Because what I think is happening is that basically, say you use reappraisal, you feel less negative, and then you you're fine, you're complacent, you're not going to do anything. But that not doing anything links up with sort of real world changes. So I think that that perception of controllability is epiphenomenal, if you will. It's not really driving the effects that we're seeing. So if you don't do something about a situation where you objectively don't have control, the situation will get worse, and sort of the injustice, the adversity and so forth will be perpetuated, and keep a system in place where you will respond with greater depression in the example that I was giving. So that's about the actual change to the actual situation, and it's about objective controllability. So that's my idea. Others in my lab disagree with me. I really don't know why. I don't get it. Like, to me, it doesn't seem logical, but like they disagree, and I'm joking. Like, they have good points for that it should be about the perception of controllability. But we haven't, to be honest, we have now started asking our participants about their perceptions of controllability, but we haven't cleanly teased it apart or like found a good answer to your question, like which one is it? Is it objective controllability, subjective controllability, and if so, sort of how do they play a role? I think it's kind of tricky thing to, and Oz and I have had long-standing discussions about how best to measure that even. So it's a really complicated and important question. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering whether you looked at cumulative stress in one of these studies. I think in one of the studies you used daily diary study, like ecological momentary. I was thinking about the previous question, and maybe like disagreement with a friend might be like a controllable, stressful thing for one person who doesn't have other stressful events at a similar time, but for another person who had like other stressful events in their lives, even just a disagreement with a friend might be like very uncontrollable event for them. So I was just wondering whether you looked at how much stressful event that they experience like in a given period.
Cumulatively. Yeah. So all the I think all of the, so in all the studies, when we look at sort of stressors as the predictor of well-being, we look at cumulative stress, meaning that we look at what stressors participants experience, and then how impactful each of those stressors was. Sort of like a cumulative severity index. And usually we go back 18 months. So because I think you're absolutely right, sort of like one single thing might not stress people out, but it's sort of like the cumulative impact of everything that they experience that's more important to capture. There's a second piece in what you're asking, right, which sort of, and that's really something that makes our lives really difficult, which is a linkage between stress severity and controllability. And that's absolutely also something that we see that we try to statistically control for, so that when we look at severity, we try to look at that independent of controllability to isolate the effects out. But in real life, the two are usually pretty highly correlated with one another. And it goes, I think, both directions. What's uncontrollable usually is experienced as more stressful, and more stressful events will make us feel like we have less control. So that makes it even more tricky. Yeah.
I'm going to voice, one or two questions from the chat. So the question is about the relationship between sense of power and beliefs of controllability and self-efficacy. Are you talking about self-efficacy? Is it the same thing? And a related question is, how does mindful acceptance play a role in the storyline? Is it just like reappraisal? I mean, do we expect acceptance to be harmful under conditions of controllable stress?
Interesting. Okay. So the first question is about self-efficacy and whether that's sort of like the same as sense of power. So no. So Serena Chen is the person who studies power in this collaboration. And basically, from what I understand, is that sense of power from Serena Chen's research is that sense of power is a larger sense that is global about yourself and your standing and your influence in the world. And basically what she and I started with was the observation that very little research has actually put together power and emotion regulation. And my interest in controllability, I think, started part of that conversation, which essentially has to do a lot with power. And so more directly addressing the question, I think that self-efficacy is part of sense of power. So if you have high sense of power, you're going to have relatively high self-efficacy. So the question then is that true? Does that apply to your own emotions? And you could sort of expect it to go one of two ways. One way is to think that, yes, I'm going to be more self-efficacious with regard to my own emotions and think that I have a relatively high degree of control over my emotions. But you could also expect the opposite almost, where if I have high power, I might feel entitled to my emotions and not even think to control my emotions. And so in that regard, sort of we could have expected it to go one of two ways, and found that consistently across 4 different studies, higher sense of power was related to a belief and an enactment that I can control my emotions. At the same time, high sense of power was also related to the belief that I shouldn't have to control my emotions. So it's really both. Now, mindful acceptance is a really interesting case because in some ways it could be taken to be the opposite of reappraisal, right? In reappraisal, you change your emotions. In mindful acceptance, you accept your emotions, you don't change them. But what we find in reality is that the two are almost orthogonal, sometimes even positively related to one another. And so what we think is happening is that if you are if you have the ability to be flexible about your emotions, think about them flexibly, have I guess self-efficacy is not a bad word. You also might be more ready to accept your emotions without being fearful of them. And the other way around, if you accept your emotions, you're aware of them, you might then also be better able to use reappraisal. Now, we haven't looked at the last part of that question, which is, does acceptance also have relatively bad effects in the context of more controllable stressors? My idea is no, because I think it's a fairly nuanced I guess, way of thinking about it, but because acceptance also leads to, in the longer term, less negative emotion. But my sense is that people are still, when you're accepting your emotions, you're still more aware of them, and you might maintain the emotions that are useful to you in the moment, whereas reappraisal might have more of a across the board, which we saw in the last study, decreasing of negative emotions. So I'm going out on a limb here, but my sense is that acceptance would not have the same negative effects that reappraisal has in the context of controllable stress. But I don't know. Maya's nodding, so yeah, I would be very interested in hearing thoughts one way or the other, and we're interested in doing the research on that. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. I saw your hand up earlier, so I'm so sorry. I didn't track it carefully enough. Hopefully we have enough time, but let me ask you first.
One of the post-culture differences in, as we know that some countries has so much uncontrollable events that is coming to them, and there are other countries who have so much control over anything in their life, and they don't have to think about anything at all because their government take care of everything. But country like us is not a good example, because we have always tried to think about our government, not government basically thinking about ourselves. For that reason, I'm starting to think about our reappraisal ability. For example, countries like Turkey and other countries' reappraisal abilities effect on their well-being and also resilience capacity and stress ability. Do you think any idea or any cross-cultural studies that is looking at the countries who have shaky systems and more stable, strong system?
Thinking that there's more, if you live in a shaky, more unpredictable, less controllable system, self-control might become more important in a cross-nation examination. And I can't think of any research that would directly speak to your question. I think it's a really super interesting question, more on a macro level. How does predictability, controllability of our context change the links, the usefulness of different kinds of emotion regulation? And I think it's a great hypothesis. I want to say, my first instinct is to say yes. That seems like a very sensical hypothesis. Something makes me hesitate, and that's I guess the idea that we would ever recommend, oh, like you're in a really uncontrollable context, just like regulate your emotions, you know, like that's a very uncomfortable thing to say. And I don't think it's really true. And I'm trying to stay sort of true to the argument, right? The principled argument. And maybe it comes back to what my lab and I have been discussing, that maybe there is something to the perception of controllability. And maybe it comes also down to what do you try to control, right? If I'm a citizen of a country, and it maybe also goes back to your question about the Trump study, right? Like how controllable is it? And I think, oh, I want to like take down Trump, like that. I don't have control over that, but I can go, and in our country, we can go protest. In our country, we can do things. In other countries, we might have to find other avenues to exert control. So it might, you know, come back to, it's not a yes control, no control type of question, but look within the spheres of one's life where one can exert control. And maybe that's where your question was coming from as well. So yeah, it's very evocative. And I know Maya and others have done research looking at emotion regulation on a sort of community, nation level. And I think that would be a really interesting way to sort of look in a broader way. Yeah. Thank you.
And this is one last question.
So I like the example about like Hillary Clinton versus Trump case. And a couple of years later, I mean, I believe in that study reappraisal is much prevalent for Democrats. And several years later, what we observe also from Republican attacking the Senate. And I think they are actually consider these things as controllable, right? So they make these bold movements. So ideally, we consider the political leaning or where they land on the political spectrum should be uncoupled from the mechanisms that they are employing. But what might be the reason we see these different mechanisms from different political groups?
Sorry, can you say that again? Like you're saying.
For the Hillary Clinton supporters, reappraisal mechanisms were more dominant, I believe. But for the many years later, when Trump supporters attacked the Senate and tried to take control, they basically choose to use those mechanisms. So these are two political groups, and ideally we expect their political leaning shouldn't have any relationship between the mechanisms that they choose, like how they consider the situations controllable versus uncontrollable, but somehow they differentiate. And do you have any guess or suggestion what might be the reason?
So I don't think that, I don't know whether that's what you meant. I don't think that Trump supporters use less reappraisal in general. Is that what you?
Situation attack the Senate, right?
Yes. I wouldn't go. So yes, that is one example of people taking into, oh, you mean, why am I saying that's like a better way of doing this?
I don't know. I mean, whether.
But I wasn't saying that, just to be clear.
I think so. It's like whether political leaning can't predict, they use more appraisal or.
You know, I don't know. I think there was a little bit of research. Actually, Matt Feinberg and Oliver John did a study looking at reappraisal and politics but that was just one study. And if I remember correctly, it didn't replicate that Democrats were better at, do you remember this one? Democrats were better at or more ready to use reappraisal compared to conservatives. I think that research has not sort of across the board, but it's really the only study that I can think of right now. I think in general, it has not been found to be the case that conservatives use less reappraisal than liberals. And it's also, you can sometimes, I think, sort of think that, oh, maybe it's sort of related to education levels or something like that, because it's a relatively complex transformation, but that's also not found to be the case. So sorry, I misunderstood your question. I don't think that there's a link between politics and reappraisal, but I do think you're absolutely right that people use reappraisal in motivated ways. I think that's absolutely true. And so and they might also not use reappraisal in motivated ways, as Maya's research has shown. So yeah, but I do like the broader question about politics and emotion regulation. That's a really interesting whole big set of questions that I think we don't know enough about. Yeah. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.